So now there's been a few weeks of tournament data in, let's take a look at which armies are shaping up to be the top 10 armies of Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it could be interesting to take a look at some of the scariest armies out there in the game. Talking through the armies from a few different perspectives, both from which ones just seem to be winning the most games in general, but also which ones are overperforming at the very tops of tournaments. For this one I thought we'd try and do a top 10 strongest armies that seem to be performing best for the average player out there, and with tournament stats and data and things there's a few different ways to assess army strength, all of which are important in their own ways. I usually like to talk through in terms of overall win percentage, just quite a nice rough and ready metric to gauge overall army strength for the average player, though it definitely does have limitations, say like not necessarily reflecting the armies that can go on to win super major tournaments and things. Might be influenced a bit by the type of players that play the faction, and a few other things. I'll still talk through the factions in that order, but also I'll look at a few other stats, the percentage of people choosing to take them along to grand tournaments, which kind of shows enthusiasm to play an army, the numbers of grand tournament event wins, and I'll also include armies that have gone 5 games undefeated, even if they happen to be in a big tournament and lost after that. There's quite a few of those at the moment thanks to the Las Vegas Open. Lots of players that basically would have won a grand tournament with those performances if they'd been elsewhere. And also take a look at a high placings weighted per the number of players. People who only had 1 defeat at a grand tournament weighted for the numbers of players to sort of give you a percentage chance of how often players get to the top tables of events. For looking at these numbers, I took a look at a bunch of different sources for this one. I still say that Mesa Monday is probably the single most helpful, having included and updated all the data for the LVO. Though also StatCheck 40k and Den of Fools have other interesting datasets as well, each great in their own ways, and Goonhammer and Best Coast Pairings also track tournament stats and lists as well. Big credit for them for putting out some fun numbers to look at. I'll link to them in the video description. In general though, broadly game balance seems to be in a pretty good spot right now. For the average player, most win rates tend to be between 45 and 55%, even if there maybe are a few factions pushing at the boundaries each way. I definitely do feel like there's a few top dogs and builds though, and we'll talk through a few of them now. As ever, I'll just doubly underline that in general win rates aren't everything. While I'm talking through these in terms of win rate power, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything on this top 10 strongest list is necessarily overpowered or anything like that, or even one of the best things to win big tournaments. Some lower win rate armies can be absolutely top tier in the right hands or with the right specific army builds, and particularly so with a smart player who knows them well. 40k in general just tends to be a lot more player skill dependent than exact army dependent right now. On the flip side, it's often things like Custodians and Knights and big stat check armies like that, where they might often have better win rates compared with their top level performance, just showing that they're sort of better in different circumstances really. In any case, jumping into things properly, and here's some honourable mentions for the mid-tier of 40k factions, all still strong armies with good builds but maybe not really vying for the very best in the game right now. Here we have Grey Knights, Eldari, Tyranids all on 50%, and Dark Angels and World Eaters on 49%. At the moment, at least compared with the competition, I would say they're fairly well balanced right now. Both doing okay in win rates for the average player, but also maybe solid but not excessive performance at the top level, with say winning tournaments and going 5-0 at different events. Besides them though, for just one other honourable mention that I think deserves to be basically sort of on the list anyway, I thought I'd talk about Orks. They're at around about 48% wins so far, so wouldn't quite make the top 10 or even the previous honourable mention shout out, even if they're not really all that far behind at all. But it does seem that the Greenskins have just been having an excessively good time in terms of actual event wins and things over the past few weeks, out of armies that have either won tournaments or have a 5-0 undefeated run. They're second by that metric as best I can tell, with 8 placings there, second only to one other army. Otherwise they're still relatively popular at 8th most played out of 27. After that play rate it does look like they're overrepresented on the top tables, around about 16% of players turning up with them having taken 1 or no losses over the event. For the balance changes, it was broadly good news for the Orks. They had a small nerf with the slightly pricier War Boss, who is an important datasheet, but it wasn't anything insurmountable, and beyond that they've had 3 really good buffs really. Calling war at the start of the command phase is quite a nice advantage, as your opponent doesn't necessarily know whether it's coming. It means that they can't fully plan for it. If you call it at the start of the battle round and then just react to that, it means they have to hedge their bets a little bit. They got the powerful datasheets in Breaker Boys and Tank Busters, both of which are pretty savage against tough stuff, and that's a role that the Greenskins have been lacking. And then they also had the new Tactical Brigade, which does seem to be the single most played in competitive play now, more so than Warhorde. It was a good combination of both really quite fun and really quite strong. Out of the two, it does seem that Tactical Brigade has been getting far more wins versus Warhorde. They both are doing at least kind of okay, and there's a few people using the other detachments, particularly Dreadmob and Bully Boys, and a few people playing Green Tide. for strong Orky units at the moment. War bosses still remain very fighty and very efficient at 75 points, same with beast bosses and beast snagger boys. Ghazghkull Thraka is often at the heart of most lists, maybe a little bit less auto-include and tactical brigade. Gretchen can rustle up command points and score points, Storm Boys can deep strike and score more points, and generally transports full of dangerous melee stuff tends to be the way to go, often with trucks or maybe battle wagons trucking up the table. As mentioned, Tank Busters and Breaker Boys have made a big splash and are both seeing a lot of play in all sorts of lists. The Tank Busters are kind of excessively good in Tactical Brigade though, particularly led by some shock attack gun mechs to order them, and usually the auto-include unit of 10 flash kits with a mech to lead them turns up as well to lay down some absolutely monstrous Dakka. It still doesn't seem that the Orks are particularly easy to win with as a whole though. They've still got a very average looking win rate, though it might well rise as we get more data. It does feel like internal balance maybe doesn't look awesome for them right now though, with Tactical Brigade kind of heavily overshadowing the rest a bit. In any case, looks like the Orks are having a good time with their most cunning generals around. Getting into the list proper though, and next up we have the Death Guard. They started off the first tournament weekend with some quite dismal performance, but rapidly rose up. I was certainly expected them to really, given that they were pretty strong before and only really got a couple of small buffs in the balance updates. It still looks like they're minus 2% compared with where they were previously, though I really wouldn't be too surprised if they rose up a bit higher in terms of raw win percentage with more data coming in. It seems that they're doing pretty well at topping tournaments though, 6 either event wins or 5-0 undefeated runs. They're very appropriately the 7th most popular army at tournaments, which feels a bit better than usual for them. They're a bit more middling in terms of the average Death Guard player breaking into the top tables at around about 15th out of 27 for the 40k armies on that metric. For the balance changes, the Death Guard didn't really get much. Mortarion gained Deep Strike and they had their tiny Predator Annihilator buff. I don't think they really needed all that much though. The majority of their units do see play and plenty of them are really quite strong, even if there's still certain data sheets like particularly the Blight Lord Terminators that could use a bit of help. They also got their Grotmust detachment in the Flyblown host, though it does seem like basically everyone's still playing Plague Company. The general reaction was that Flyblown just wouldn't really be quite as strong versus that one, though it does look like one person went undefeated with it in the past weekend. Death Guard do feel like they're an army with maybe a few more options than before, though a few lists tend to be a bit convergent still. Typhus and Mortarion tend to be in just about every list, usually backed up by a few Demon Engine heavy hitters, either Blight Haulers, Bloat Drones or Predator Destructors. Allied War Dogs are often a good idea, with Carnivores bringing some speed and damage. Brigands may be taking advantage of contagions, some Nurglings to infiltrate the midfield, and then for the actual on-foot Plague Marines and things doing damage, they often take to battle in a Rhino transport accompanied by a Biologist Putrefier for some critical hits and grenades, or potentially with a Foul Blight spawn. The Death Shroud Terminators tend to be in the vast majority of army lists as well, just an enormous amount of stats for their points cost, even if they do move slowly. It still seems that Death Guard are a big force to be reckoned with, and again I really wouldn't be too surprised if their win rates continue to rise a bit over the next few weeks. For weaknesses and criticisms, I guess I'd talk about the Blight Lord Terminators, plus the fact they tend to be quite slow and ponderous, maybe without quite as many options for movement tricks and scoring secondaries as fast, and it looks like things might change for them in the not too distant future given that we know their Codex is on the horizon. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. One option to get a full board of 40k terrain on the tabletop that's unusually easy to pack up, fold flat and transport. The idea behind their terrain set is to make a 45 by 60 inch gaming board the right size for 40k. That's constructed by 12 tiles in a grid formation, and when you fold out each cardboard tile, up pops a building. So the idea is to have a battlefield that can fold flat and spring up immediately when you need it, and then all be packed away into a box set that's roughly the same sort of size as a standard board game. It could be handy enough if you need to transport terrain and you don't have all that much space, and also doesn't hurt that it doesn't require any hobby effort whatsoever to be able to put on the table, and it's certainly a lot cheaper than a full board of Games Workshop style terrain as well. There's definitely some pros and cons to it, maybe more so than most other terrain sets with its cardboard construction. I'll talk through a few of the pros, cons and terrain set options at the end of the video for those who are interested, but in any case feel free to check them out. There'll be links down in the video description below. Thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Moving on though, and in 9th place we have the Blood Angels. Their tournament win rate seemed to be around 51%, unchanged from the previous update pretty much. They're being played 10th most out of the 27 factions at big tournaments, so plenty of people putting them on the table, no doubt a little bit more inspired by their recent range release compared with some. They've got 3 either event wins or 5-0 undefeated runs, and are sort of middling once again for their percentage chance of breaking into the top tables if you take them to a tournament, 14th out of the 27 40k factions there. In the last balance update, they got a few positives and negatives. The Sanguinary Guard dropped 5 points, which wasn't a huge change, but they were also one of the stronger units anyway, so kind of helped them out there. The Mephiston and the Rage-Fueled Warrior enhancement for Space Marine captains went up a bit, and both of those were very popular choices in Liberator previously. They did enjoy some of the Codex Space Marine datasheet buffs. Outriders can potentially hit a bit harder, they quite like scouts with AP-1 knives, and even Stern Guard can be weirdly fighty if you build for them. And otherwise, for detachment things, they gained that Angelic Inheritors detachment. They had the Armour of Contempt nerf, which means it's not quite as good against shooting anymore, and while they didn't get the boosted +1 to wound Oath of Moment that the rest of the Space Marines got, technically they can still get it with Liberator if you don't take any Blood Angels unique datasheets, giving you a new and weird way to play them if you want to. For the detachments that get used in competitive play, the vast majority of people are playing Liberator Assault Group, maybe around about 85% or so of people. So the people who are trying out the new character-focused Angelic Inheritors seem to be doing okay. There was one notable high placing with them at the Las Vegas Open. Quite a lot of their staples are still playable, Sanguinary Guard with maybe Dante or Captains, or even on their own. Death Company is still fearsome with Lamates as a great big damage punch. Assault Intercessors with Captains jumping out of Impulsors can do very well, particularly the Rage-Fueled Warrior one. Jump Intercessors can skirmish extra hard here, and just about any of the other Codex Space Marine melee things support things like Infiltrators or Scouts, and often being backed up by a few gun tanks like Vindicators, they can all do rather well as well. Overall, they definitely have a whole bunch of raw hitting power, particularly in Liberator Assault Group. They perhaps need a few more big decisions than certain armies out there, really sizing up what their units are capable of killing in a single round and what they're not, and making sure that they make good trades and manage to kill more of the opponent than you're leaving exposed to get killed in return. Overall, they're still looking like a fearsome army to take on at the moment though. Next up and ranking in 8th place by these metrics are Core Codex Space Marines, and it seems that the actual standard Adeptus Astartes have really risen up in the world, going from around about 45% wins pre-update to around about 51% now, so a big 6% jump there. Space Marines are the most collective 40k army, and it's maybe not too big surprise that they're the most popular thing to put on the table in tournaments when they're strong again. They're first out of the 27 armies, though they hadn't been previously, with lots of people choosing to play other things. Out of armies that have actually won the most tournaments, they've had the most success, 12 players either winning tournaments or going 5-0 undefeated in a row, and they were very well represented in the top tables of the Las Vegas Open in particular. In terms of top placings per play rate though, they're again a bit more middling there, around about 14% breaking into the top tables, and I feel like perhaps the win rate and that sort of metric are maybe a little bit obscured by the different people playing Space Marines of different chapters. I feel like it's maybe hiding the trend that it's basically Ultramarines are massively strong at the moment and one of the most powerful armies in the game, but lots of people collect all sorts of various other chapters that aren't Ultramarines and still want to run them as such, and most of them just don't really have options on the same sort of level as things like Calgar, Guilliman and Uriel Ventris. For the balance changes last time for Space Marines, they had massive amounts of stuff. The huge +1 to wound Oath buff was one of the single most important things, meaning that they're not usually ever hurting for damage against one tough target, and with Rebute Guilliman you can then kill it and go on to the second one if you want to. They got the Armour of Contempt nerf, a few choice Ultramarines points rises with Calgar going to 200 and Ventris to 95, massive amounts of datasheet rules rewrites with buffs to things like Intercessors, Outriders, Reavers and more. Sternguard also got their big rerolls as well. They got the Librarius Conclave, which maybe isn't the most played detachment, though it isn't unusable, and Gladius got a Fire Discipline nerf, kind of breaking that combo to make it useless for the points it costs. They definitely had a lot going on, but it seems that at least some Space Marine lists are really rising up. In terms of detachment played, it still looks like there's plenty of options, though the people winning the tournament are almost always playing Ultramarines. Gladius, Ironstorm and Vanguard are the ones that are seeing the most play and success, with Firestorm being the next most popular. The majority of them are playing around with Guilliman, though not literally every single one. Aside from Ultramarine stuff, some staples at the moment seem to be the Ballistas Dreadnought and the Vindicators for dealing big damage to the enemy and also being pretty hard to hit back as well. They've both got good defensive profiles with 2+ saves. For supporting objective scoring units, things like Intercessors, Scouts, Infiltrators, Jump Intercessors and Inceptors can all be good for scoring objectives, as can the Combi Weapon Lieutenant. It seems a fair few lists are taking some incursors to buff the rest of the Space Marine firepower, and several of the Ultramarines lists are putting either Calgar or Ventris alongside some company heroes, sometimes both of those guys getting a retinue of them. The majority of the other datasheets in the Codex are at least playable as well. That might depend a fair bit on the detachment, say some Devastator Centurion if playing Vanguard Spearhead, or going heavy on the tanks vehicles and maybe a Tech Marine or so in Ironstorm. Overall, looks like at least the Ultramarines are monstrously strong at the moment. I feel like perhaps their biggest issue is the fact that it still looks like the other chapters are rather overshadowed and not seeing too much play. I really wouldn't be too surprised if Ultramarines take some nerfs given the performance that they've been having at the moment. Next up, and perhaps one of the more unexpected placings on the list, are Drukhari. Admittedly though, I think that there's probably an element of slightly low data randomness putting them up this high. At such low levels, individual players like Mr. Scary of course can influence the percentages just a tiny bit. By my estimations, it looks like him going to a couple of tournaments and winning lots of games genuinely appears to have bumped them up by around about 2 percentage points. In any case, overall, and accounting for their best player, they've had win rates of around about 52%, which is actually slightly up compared with previously, at least so far. They might drop off a bit from now though. And they are one of the lesser played armies at tournaments, with their popularity being 22nd out of 27 so far. They've only had the 1-5-0 or better undefeated run that I've seen so far, and that was from Scary at LVO. Though in general, outside of actually winning events, there have been really quite a lot of high placings for that limited number of Drukhari players. It seems that around about 18% of them have been going, say, 4 wins, 1 loss and things like that, and that puts Drukhari third in terms of breaking into the top tables there. Looks like a small group of skilled players have been doing rather well with them. For the balance changes, it was broadly mild bad news for the Drukhari. They got cheaper racks, but they did get some nerfs to Scourges, the Void Raven, and big grotesque squads. I think people were initially maybe a little bit borderline on the Reaper's Wager Grotmas detachment, though it does actually seem to be paying some big dividends for the faction. It looks like people have embraced that as perhaps the single most competitive detachment currently. By the tournament numbers, it looks like people are playing it fairly equally versus Sky Splinter, and the Reaper's Wager has a little bit higher numbers versus that one. Almost no one seems to be playing Real Space Raiders at the moment compared with those two. Overall, within the army though, most things tend to be at least usable. There are maybe a bunch of common staples in a bunch of lists though, like Kronos, maybe some Talos for some raw strength, a Beastmaster for scouting and board control and disruption, Cabalites and Venoms for sticky objectives, a big unit of Witches with Lilith in a Raider, some Mandrakes for infiltrating and warping on and off the board with their fade away. Scourges still with their jump shoot jump and big scary firepower, even if they're paying a big premium for that ability now, and there's often an Archon to lead the whole thing. The Reaper's Wager army list generally tending to be going very light on the Harlequins, maybe just a single troop and troop master perhaps. In general, it seems that the Drukhari are enjoying the melee support stratagems though, delivering some dangerous melee into close combat with a few other sneaky tricks beyond Sky Splinter. In general though, it doesn't really seem like people are the most enthusiastic to play Drukhari now still, and maybe being overly dependent on their Harlequin allies detachment isn't exactly ideal for them either, even if it does feel like a fun and different way to play, and you don't have to go too heavy on the Space Clowns if you don't want to. In any case, it doesn't look like the Drukhari are completely out of the running at the moment, perhaps less so than people might have expected due to the Reaper's Wager being alright, even if they don't tend to be the thing that most people would rate to top big tournaments. Next up, and in 6th place, with win rates of 52% as well, we have the Adeptus Custodes, the big armoured golden boys having risen up a little bit, plus 3% compared with before. They're being very, very popular to put on the table at the moment, the third most popular out of the 27 factions. Have done very well with either topping events or going 5-0 undefeated with 3 of those, and also seem to be unusually good at breaking into the top tables as well, with 16% of players getting an X and 1 result or better, and that's 5th out of the 27 factions. For their balance changes, they basically had 2 nice improvements. Versus Praetors, as their jet bikes got a big buff, getting tougher and more dangerous with a special rule that actually works now. And it does seem that despite the points increase with that, they are actually being taken in competitive lists. They seem to have appeared in at least a fair amount of some Talons of the Emperor and Shield Host lists that I looked at, usually seeming to go in squads of 2. Otherwise though, and maybe the more impactful thing, is getting access to their Dreadnought detachment in the Solar Spearhead, with big Dreadnought profile buffs to make them move faster and potentially get more dangerous as well. For the detachments being used at the moment, it does look like people have really embraced that new one. The Solar Spearhead is the single most played, then Shield Host, then Talons of the Emperor. And it does seem that between the 3 of them, they've all been doing alright. Maybe Solar Spearhead and Talons of the Emperor initially look like they're doing better for the numbers than the standard Shield Host, though all of them are doing acceptably, I'd say. For their currently stronger units, for just general staples, Wardens with Blade Champions are hard to go too far wrong with, both very tough, fairly fast, and pretty dangerous. Kyria Draxus is often seen leading some Custodian Guard, as she synergizes really well with their shooting rules. Caladius tanks are pretty furious, effective anti-tank units, and some objectives can be grabbed by some scoring Sisters of Silence. As mentioned, Virtus Praetors are genuinely seeing some good use in Talons and Shield Host. Venetaria is still very much a thing, and in the Solar Spearhead, the Dreadnoughts of choice tend to be the Venerable Contemptors. It seems that the buff stats and damage improvement and speed is all they needed to get good, and they're the ones that can be annoying to kill with the chance to resurrect on death, usually backed up by a couple of Telemon heavy Dreadnoughts, enormously tough tanky things. They can bring their might to bear a fair bit better in that detachment. In general, Custodes do have a bit of a reputation of being maybe a little bit more of an obvious and sort of stat check style army, maybe not having quite as many big options for clever plays. though it doesn't really seem to be holding them back too much at the moment. They seem to be doing very well on all metrics between actual event wins, tournament placings, and the amount of people choosing to put them on the table. Next up, we have the boys in black in the Deathwatch, placing 5th here, and also on a win rate of 52%. They don't really have a before number, given that they were part of the Imperial agents, and therefore no one was playing them. It's still fairly early days since their Black Spear index came back. They're the 26th out of the 27 most armies played. The only one lower than them is the Imperial agents, maybe partly being an unusual army that needs some odd unit combinations, and particularly some new ones recently. That doesn't help all that much. Plus, even with their digital rules coming back, the idea that Games Workshop sort of took them away for a bit and almost killed them off as a Space Marine sub-faction altogether doesn't exactly breed confidence with people wanting to jump into them. It does mean that with that lower play rate though, the rest of the data is kind of unreliable, so it's going to be far more random than most, and that 52% wins could be a fair bit higher or lower. Still though, given that they've just been used by Mr. Mark Hurtle to win the LVO, pretty much 40k's biggest and well-respected 40k singles tournament, and going a straight 10-0 against all manner of top-tier 40k players, absolutely shows that they've got what it takes to be an incredibly strong army, and beyond that I think they won one other event as well. Not too bad out of such a tiny player base. For their rules at the moment, they regained their Space Marine supplement status, with their Primaris kill teams and Terminators coming back. The Primaris kill teams are big, chunky, and really quite dangerous, and the Terminators with their triple Cyclone missile launchers are unusually cheap for that kind of profile. They did have some recent errata that meant that the Black Spear mission tactics will be locked to the kill teams only, and that might potentially be a small blow to the faction, but it's not exactly the biggest thing in the world, and the kill teams are strong enough to be able to absolutely build around as your central damage dealers. In general, it does tend to be the Black Spear that's being used in competitive play with all its special issue ammo and teleport tricks, generally tending to build around Deathwatch veterans, often with a Watchmaster in tow. The Primaris kill teams of choice are the Talonstrike ones and the Indomitor ones for the majority of successful competitive lists so far. They were both present in the Las Vegas Open one, though some people have been running more of them too. And the Tome of Ectoclades, the Beacon Angelus, and the character with a Thief of Secrets like a Judas here does very well. The enhancements are well worth having on the board. Despite having a whole bunch of cool stuff and options, they're not always necessarily going to be the easiest army to play with. Really quite big expensive kill teams that need you to be able to make some big decisions and not have them killed too easily or wasted their firepower against things that don't matter. They maybe don't tend to be super heavy on the cheap objective support style units as well, which might make them struggle for secondaries a bit more than some. And I guess in theory they might be a tiny bit weaker following that Black Spear nerf, though I don't really think it's a make and break style thing. I guess it means that non-Deathwatch unique units will be kept to a bit of a minimum in their army list though. Overall, broadly seems to be a good time to be Deathwatch. I'm sure we'll see a bunch of people have renewed interest in them after they've just won the Las Vegas Open of all things. In 4th place, with current win rates just a little bit above them, are the Astra Militarum, and bear in mind that these are still the indexed Astra Militarum numbers. We have had the codex out with new points costs and all the new datasheets and detachments and things, but that won't be hitting the competitive scene for a while yet. It still seems that those points costs that Games Workshop published are kind of interim ones, and only recommended for tournament play when the actual codex gets released individually. In any case though, even without that, the Guard have pretty much retained their very strong position where they were before the balance updates, only dropping down a single percentage point thanks to the intervention of Bridgehead Strike it seems. Loads of people are still putting them on the table as the 5th most popular faction in tournaments. They're winning lots of events and going undefeated at plenty more. 6 in total over the past few weeks of tournaments, and that's one of the best records of any of the armies in the top 5. And it seems that in terms of armies that you turn up to a tournament with the likelihood of placing highly and only having one loss or less, they performed the very best on that metric with a big 20% there. Not massively far ahead, but just slightly ahead of the other Warhammer 40k factions. For their balance changes, they had quite a lot going on. They had lots of points nerfs to strong units, plenty of things besides the tanks really got hit. Lord Solar can't order Bulgrins and things, and his scope has been reduced a bit. Tempestus Aquilons can only drop to 6 inches. They got their new Rattling datasheet, though it didn't really add too much for them there, unlike the Orks. But what did add a lot was the Bridgehead Strike, the new Scion-focused attachment for some drop-in special weapon death. It does seem that in terms of the strongest guard attachments, Bridgehead Strike absolutely seems to be out-competing Combined Regiment at the moment. For people turning up to Grand Tournaments, only a third are using Bridgehead Strike, though it's faring far better than Combined Regiment, with win rates around about 60% versus 45%. I guess some of that might be a shift from top players choosing to shift to Bridgehead, and the actual disparity probably isn't quite that big, but still it does feel like that's the way to go for guard at the moment. It is maybe a bit frustrating for some players out there, given that you need tons of Scions to make it work. It's just not going to be fieldable for everyone, and kind of understandable that a lot of people are still going to be playing Combined Regiment. In Bridgehead Strike, it tends to be Scions and Aquilons backed up by some Kazakin with various support units, and I saw a few lists using mortars alongside Ursula Crees. Combined regiment lists tend to be the more tank-focused ones, Lord Solar often issuing orders to a bunch of Rogue Aldorns, Olorosses and tank commanders, perhaps with some Sentinels marking the way with their rerolls. There's lots of love for Gaunt's Ghost as well, being able to jump on and off the board and do secondaries and have a bunch of other fun utility. In any case, at the moment it looks like Index Astra Militarum is going to remain as an absolute powerhouse until the Codex rules go live. That'll bring some changes, and it looks like the Scion units were going to go up in points as well, which might affect Bridgehead a bit, even if they got some nice rules too. It's going to be interesting to see the impact of the changes once the new book hits tournaments, what people are going to go for with their top lists, and what's going to wind up on top. At first impressions though, it still looks like the Guard Codex is going to be very strong if it's played by the current points cost that they've published, though there's no saying that they might not update some more points cost when the book goes live in full. Ranking in third on the win percent metrics are the Imperial Knights, the big stompy robots having a better time than most, though for these I would bear in mind that they often tend to do better in win rates versus actually winning tournaments or placing at top tables, just due to so much of their strength coming from big chunky stat lines that people struggle to deal with, as opposed to more high level clever tricks that you might do. It still seems they're not really being taken to tournaments all that much, 16th out of the 27 factions, so a bit underrepresented and aren't generally tended to be regarded as the sort of thing that win grand tournaments all that much, even though they haven't actually been doing all that bad on that metric so far. I think they won 2 at least fairly chunky grand tournaments and went undefeated at another. And they do seem to be breaking into top tables better than most armies currently, 15% of Knights lists losing just 1 game or less, or 8th out of the 27 factions. In general it does kind of imply that they're towards the stronger end of Warhammer 40k, though perhaps as is often the case maybe being more the terrors of small tournaments as opposed to being powerhouses in big ones. I feel like Imperial Knights being in this kind of position wasn't really all that hard to predict. They had win rates around about 50% before, and then they dropped the Armiger Warglaves and Armiger Helverins by 10 points each, which is just really quite a direct boost to the power of the faction given that they were 2 of the strongest units already, and people were usually taking something like 4 to 8 of them in a lot of army lists, never mind the fact that because they're even cheaper and more efficient, people are now taking more. They also gains their allied Admech detachment, though it doesn't look like anyone's been playing with that one at all. Losing the 6+ Feel No Pain and the Rotate Ion Shields from the core detachment is pretty painful, never mind anything else, even if it does give them a few more supporting options. In terms of strong units in armies at the moment, Armiger spam lists have definitely risen up more than they were. A few people have been taking a lot of them previously, but now it seems to be quite a lot of people. It looks like there's been a few high placing lists with just the 1 Titanic Knight or maybe even none, and taking pretty hefty numbers of the newer cheaper Armigers, and alongside a few cheap scoring units, maybe a Ministorum Priest or Calidus Assassin or various other flavours of Imperial Agents chaff. For the Titanic Knights, most are usable enough. Canis Rex, the Knight Atropos and the Knight Lancer are all still powerhouses, the Errant's still nice, and most of the other variants are decently good as well. I still say the weaknesses are maybe kind of obvious. They can often be screened and held back, or suffer against things that go super heavy on the anti-tank and don't have quite as much subtlety or clever stuff that they can do versus other factions, but their raw numbers still seem to be having them do absolutely fine in competitive play, and it seems that numbers from more casual datasets seem to have them do even better. Next up and placing in second, also with win rates around 54%, are the Necrons. They'd risen up a +3% compared with pre-update, though I bear in mind that these numbers are basically from before the Star Shatter nerf, plenty of tournaments last weekend, not using Games Workshop's new errata, and while I certainly don't think that it kills the detachment, it did take some noticeable nerfs to their best detachment right now. In any case, loads of people are putting Necrons on the table, they're generally quite popular and were before the update, though they're still the second most played army at tournaments, only losing out to the core Codex Space Marines with all their collectors. They have still been either winning or going undefeated at a good amount of events, with 6 placings there in the top 5, and they are breaking into the top tables really regularly as well, with 17% of Necron players doing so on that metric, putting them 4th out of the 27 factions. For their balance changes, Necrons definitely had a massive amount of upheaval. They had a fair few small-ish points nudges that might have mildly incentivized or discouraged certain things but didn't change masses. The bigger changes were to their detachments. Hypergrips got hit by a double nerf with the 3-inch drop and the numbers of teleports decreasing. The Annihilation Legion got buffed slightly for ranged destroyers, but it was the Star Shatter Arsenal that really changed the game. The big one with big damage against things that are on objective markers, and nice boost for a good number of units beyond that, perhaps in particular Doomsday Arcs and the Silent King winning out more than most, as pretty great Necron vehicle units that can use the majority of their stratagems nicely. As people were predicting at the time, the Star Shatter does seem to have absolutely taken over competitive Necrons. It's vastly more played than the rest, over double the amount of play versus any of the rest of the Necron detachments put together. Awakened and Hypercrypt are the next most played, which I think most people would have expected as well. For the Star Shatter units, it's generally the Silent King and Doomsday Arcs, though some lists choose to shake up that formula, and then often being supported by Canoptek Reanimators for the double healing and the Hexmark to bear some enhancements, plus a whole bunch of small unit support of one sort or another, maybe sometimes with a Catacomb Command Barge with the reroll enhancement. In general though, I feel like most Necron units are usable enough in the right detachment. They do have a fair few options. The obvious change for them is the nerfs to the Star Shatter. 2 of their best stratagems went up to 2 command points, and that move after being shot stratagem went to just d6 inches, so it's nowhere near as reliable to protect Doomsday Arcs, and between all that it'll still be able to do what it could do, but you'd have to choose between the best options that bit more. I feel like a lot of lists might be pivoting to running Imhotep the Stormlord to have those command points to still use the expensive ones, even if I'm sure he won't get on well with the Silent King in the same list. Overall, I still wouldn't be too surprised if Star Shatter might still be the most played version of competitive Necrons. I guess we'll see on that front, but either way the other detachments should certainly gain a fair bit of ground. Finally, and topping the list for this one it seems, we've got the Chaos Demons, win rates of 55%, that's plus 2% from the previous update, so rising up a bit there. It seems at the moment they're the 9th most commonly played army out of the 27 factions. They're winning or going undefeated in a whole bunch of tournaments, with 6 placings there. In terms of breaking into the top tables on average, they're only second to the Astra Militarum, with a 19% on that score. Overall, very strong metrics all around, both from a competitive and casual level. For their balance changes, their core things maybe didn't alter massively. Bloodletters dropped down a bit, their 3-inch Deep Strike became a 6-inch, which was a nerf, and they shifted around Screamers a bit, becoming a bit pricier but more dangerous. I haven't seen too many people running them though. The bigger thing was adding in the 4 Grotmus detachments, which people have been speculating might be as close as we get to a Chaos Demon Codex. It does seem that people have been experimenting with all of those, though it looks like the Slaanesh Legion of Excess has been the best one. Those rather godly rerolls and fun stratagems seem to have made it the single strongest attachment for Chaos Demons currently. Not to be outdone though, Games Workshop's latest errata gave a big boost to the Demon Incursion weirdly enough. They've got a 1 command point stratagem to deep strike at 6 inches and still charge with any unit, which is kind of nuts. That's pretty crazy to have that completely independent of Greater Demon setup, and maybe we'll see a few more people experimenting back with the Incursion as a result. At the moment though, in terms of competitive play, it's around about even between the Demon Incursion and the Legion of Excess, though the Slaanesh one has been winning more tournaments and also has a higher win rate. The Incursion list haven't really changed all that much, quite a lot's playable there, often building around Greater Demons for the damage output though, and delivering some melee stuff with their Shadow of Chaos. They often like to be supported by some Nurgle stuff for objectives. Nurglings, Beasts and Plague Bearers can help with that regardless of strategy. In the Legion of Excess though, it seems to be Fiends as the single most popular thing to spam. They've got general purpose damage output that really gets on well with those rather godly rerolls, but otherwise Keepers of Secrets really like them too. Celeste is very nasty, some Scouting Seekers can help out, and maybe a few Chariots or Demonettes, though they don't generally tend to be the focus. Overall, between all that, it looks like Chaos Demons are just pretty all-round strong at the moment, and absolutely particularly if you want to go Slaanesh heavy, where the damage and speed that they can bring is rather brutal. There is some uncertainty about the fate of demons in the future. It might be that they just stay as a digital index for 10th edition. We do know that the Deity Legions are getting demons in their books, which might mean some big changes for them. That might not be the best motivation to build up demons massively unless you want to collect one of those Deity Legions, or at least until we've found out what's happening with them from Games Workshop more directly. In any case, at least by win percentage at big tournaments, that's the top 10 armies in Warhammer 40k currently. Here's a roundup of the list with the top 15. Demons first, followed by Necrons, Imperial Knights, Guard, Deathwatch and Custodes and Drukhari. Though definitely a few of the ones below in the list are still very good at topping tournaments, Ultramarines in particular, though Death Guard and Orks still having loads of high placings as well. For armies that have been getting lots of placings towards the top of tournaments, it looks like it's Guard, Demons, Drukhari, then Necrons at the top there. Orks and Tyranids being really quite high up as well, though really quite a lot of the factions are at least fairly well balanced against each other here. It looks like a fairly smooth progression from the top ones to the more mid ones. Here's the one for either tournament wins or going 5-0 undefeated in a row. These ones won't be weighted by player numbers, but it's Space Marines at the top of this, then Orks, then Guard, Death Guard and Chaos Demons after that, along with Necrons. Quite a lot of other armies that have also had some good success here though. We've got armies like Tau, Blood Angels, Dark Angels and Chaos Space Marines that I didn't talk about. Pretty much most armies in Warhammer 40k can incredibly win grand tournaments at the moment if using an optimal list with the right player. Finally, here's the top 15 for play rate at grand tournaments currently. It's Space Marines followed by Necrons and Custodes. Tyranid is still well up there in 10th edition, then Guard, Chaos Marines, Death Guard and Orks following them. I feel like out of those ones, maybe Custodes and Death Guard are higher placing than normal, and Space Marines have definitely riven up a fair few places, with all the hype around the recent buffs that they got, though it's not really too uncommon to see them claiming the top spot when they're perceived to be strong. In any case, looking forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. Which are the armies that you'd rate as the strongest ones at the moment from your perspective, whether that's trying to top grand tournaments or playing in a more casual meta? Let me know any thoughts or any other insights about the armies down in the comments. Finally, to round out the video, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. As mentioned in the segment earlier, quite a different terrain system to most, folding out cardboard terrain pieces to make a whole battlefield pop up from nowhere. Having the unusual design system does have some big positives, though it does have a couple of drawbacks too, of course. The main positive is that it's just really easy to store and transport, fitting in a box set the same size as a regular board game. There's pretty well no other terrain sets that can do that easily while still being able to deploy fast. It's far cheaper than a Board of Games Workshop terrain, and at least somewhat comparable with cheaper MDF ones as well. Definitely towards the budget end of the terrain market, and it doesn't need any painting or assembly, all ready to go immediately, which might not be the worst idea for a bunch of people, if you do need to preserve precious hobby time for the actual miniatures that you're playing with. For the commonly talked about downsides, it is a bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF, given it's made of cardboard and designed to fold flat. You do need to look after it a bit better than most. It can also be kind of hard to place models in the top floors of the buildings and things, as they're not as sturdy due to needing to fold flat. The grid layout has been criticised by a few people too. It can mean a little bit less flexibility with terrain layouts. You can still mix it up a bunch by shifting where you put the tiles and rotating them round. It might not be the worst idea to just literally have like 1 or 2 extra ruin pieces though to break up some lines of sight. It doesn't really make tournament approved layouts either, though that's not really the aim of it. In general, I've had fairly good feedback that it makes acceptable battlefields for casual gamers ready to go nice and quickly. For the sets that they've got, there's a Forgotten Furnace one, which is sort of like a Chaos Industrial Factory one. Lots of furnaces, glowing runes and manufactory type buildings. There's a more standard Ruined City one in the Shattered Hive, a bunch of bombed out buildings and rubble and armoured container type things. And then there's an Overgrown Capital set, a bunch of more verdant ruins that could make do for both either fantasy or far future style settings. Each of those ones does have an expansion centerpiece set as well, a great big cathedral type thing for the city or the capital. They're made by putting 2 tiles together to make one great big building, and then there's an infernal spire for the foundry, a great big ominous centerpiece there. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look at what they've got to offer. In any case though, I'll leave this one there for now. Hopefully I'll follow this one up with a look at the bottom end of the meta in a few days. Feel free to subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see that. Otherwise, if you'd like to support the channel, feel free to check out the 40k discount links in the video description or the Patreon page. A massive thank you to anyone supporting the channel through those. But otherwise, just an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.